The woman didn't even look at him when she said it. She was already scrolling through her phone, keys in one hand, the other waving toward the door like she was dismissing a waiter who'd brought the wrong order. "I'm not paying that," she said. "It's a routine inspection. 30 minutes of work. $240 is absurd." Vincent Callard set the invoice down on the front counter, slowly, the way a man does when he's decided not to say what he's actually thinking. "The rate's posted at the entrance, ma'am," he said. $240 covers labor and the diagnostic scan. Your rear brake pads were also sitting at about 8%. I flagged it on the report, that's included." She finally looked up. Her name was Daphne Stroud, and she'd arrived that morning in a black Audi Q8 with a client parking pass from a downtown tower hanging off the rear view. She was mid-40s, tailored blazer, the kind of woman who didn't wait in lines and expected the world to notice. "I didn't ask you to check my brake pads," she said. "No, but I'm telling you they're dangerous. That's part of the job. The job I'm not paying $240 for." She dropped her phone into her bag and looked at him with something close to pity. "I'll give you $80 for your time." The shop behind Vincent was quiet in that particular way that meant it wasn't quiet at all. 3 other mechanics had gone still without looking up. The radio was playing something low, a hockey recap from the previous night. Nobody moved. Vincent was 41 years old. He had a daughter named Clara who was 7, and she'd woken up that morning with a slight fever, enough that he'd called his neighbor Marguerite before 6 a.m. to ask if she could check in before the school bus came. He'd been at the shop since 7:30. He hadn't eaten since a granola bar in the truck. He looked at Daphne Stroud and thought about $80. He thought about how it wouldn't cover the diagnostic equipment rental, let alone the hour of work. He thought about the fact that the brake pads on her Audi were dangerously worn, and that she was going to drive it out of here either way, because that was the kind of person she seemed to be. "I can't accept $80, he said. "That doesn't even cover costs. Then I'll go somewhere else." She held out her hand for the keys. "They're in the vehicle." He kept his voice even. "I'd strongly recommend you get those brakes looked at before highway driving." "I appreciate your concern," she said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. She picked up her copy of the diagnostic report, the one he'd printed, stapled, and put in a plastic sleeve because he did that for every customer, and she tucked it into her bag without another word. The bell above the door rang when she left. Then the Audi backed out. Then it was gone. Nobody in the shop said anything for a moment. Then Kevin, who had been Vincent's apprentice for 2 years and who still hadn't learned that silence was sometimes the right answer, said from under a Silverado, "That's wild, man." "Yeah," Vincent said. He folded his copy of the invoice. He put it in the drawer under the register where disputed accounts went. Then he washed his hands and went back to work, because there were 4 more vehicles on the board, and Clara had her reading assessment next week, and he'd promised he'd practice with her every night. He'd opened Callard Automotive 6 years ago, after 12 years working at a dealership service center out in Mississauga. The dealership had paid well enough, but it had also asked him to approve service work that didn't need doing, to upsell fluid flushes to elderly customers who came in for oil changes, to document things a certain way on certain accounts. He'd done it for longer than he should have because the paycheck was steady and his marriage was already fraying, and he hadn't had the energy to add "quit my job" to the list of things falling apart. After divorce, when Clara was 14 months old and living with him full-time because Heather had moved to Vancouver for a position she'd been waiting years for. A decision that had been complicated and painful and that he'd eventually made his peace with. He'd taken the severance, borrowed money from his father, and signed the lease on a bay in an industrial unit off Wilson Avenue. He'd built it slowly. Good work, fair pricing, no upselling. The kind of shop where a customer could come in, get told exactly what needed fixing and exactly why, and leave knowing they hadn't been taken advantage of. It had taken 3 years to feel stable. It still felt precarious sometimes, the way small businesses always did, but it was his. Clara had grown up in that shop in a certain sense. Not literally. She was in school, in the care of Marguerite or his sister when he had long days, but she knew the smell of it, the layout, the names of the regulars. At 5, she'd told Marguerite she wanted to be a car doctor when she grew up. Vincent had framed the drawing she made to go along with it. It was still on the wall behind the register. The $80 offer had stung, but not because of the money itself. It had stung because of what it assumed about him, that he would take it, that he'd be relieved to get something rather than nothing, that a man in a gray work shirt standing behind a counter in an industrial unit off Wilson Avenue would blink first. He hadn't blinked. But he also knew he'd never see that $240, and the brake job she needed was going to cost someone, somewhere eventually. He hoped it wouldn't cost her more than that. 2 days later, a man came in without an appointment. He drove a Ford F-150, not new, the kind of truck that had 100,000 kilometers on it, and looked it, faded paint on the tailgate, a cracked mirror casing on the passenger side, mud-dried in the wheel wells. He parked it outside and came through the door at about 10 in the morning, when the shop was humming along steadily, and he stood at the counter and asked if someone could take a look at a sound he'd been hearing when he braked. Vincent came out to meet him. The man was older, somewhere in his mid-70s. Vincent guessed, with a deliberate way of moving that suggested he'd learned to take his time. White hair, mostly. A navy coat that was well made but had been worn enough to soften at the elbows. He had the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors or under pressure, the lines deep in the right places. "I can pull it in now if you've got a bay free," Vincent said. "Whenever suits you." Vincent got the truck on the lift. The braking sound turned out to be a caliper that was beginning to stick on the front passenger side. He walked the man through it, showed him the part, explained what would happen if it was left. The man listened. He asked one question: how long before it became dangerous? And when Vincent answered, he nodded once. "How long to fix it?" "Hour and a half, maybe 2. I've got the part in stock. Go ahead." While the truck was in the bay, the man sat in the small waiting area near the front. 2 chairs, a coffee machine that worked most of the time, a side table with some magazines nobody read. He didn't take his phone out. He just sat. Vincent noticed because he passed through twice to check on other jobs, and the man was still sitting the same way, hands rested on his knees, looking at nothing particular. Not bored. Just still in a way that most people weren't. When the work was done, Vincent printed the invoice. Parts and labor, $212. The man came to the counter, read the invoice the whole way through, every line, and then looked up. 2 days ago, he said, there was a woman who left here without paying. Vincent kept his face neutral. "We have the occasional dispute. Yeah, black Audi. She was on her phone when she came in. Offered you $80. The coffee machine clicked and hummed. Somewhere in the back, Kevin dropped a wrench. "You were here," Vincent said. "I was parked outside, waiting for a friend who runs a business 2 doors down. I had the window open." He paused. "You kept your voice very level. I try to. She was wrong." Vincent didn't say anything to that. "The diagnostic report," the man said. "You printed it for her. Put it in a sleeve. I do that for all the customers. Even the ones who don't pay. Even those." The man pulled out his wallet. He paid the invoice in cash, exact change, which meant he'd counted it out beforehand, and then he didn't move to leave. He held the receipt for a moment and looked at it. "How long have you had this place?" 6 years? Do you like it?" It was an odd question. Not rude. Just unexpected. Vincent thought about it honestly. "Yeah," he said. "I like knowing I'm telling people the truth about their cars." The man smiled, small and real. "That's a good reason," he said. He put the receipt in his coat pocket and left. His name, Vincent found out later, was Gerald Stroud. He didn't find that out until the following week when a woman called and asked to speak with him and introduced herself as Corinne Bakshi, and said she was calling on behalf of Gerald Stroud, who would like to offer Vincent a contract for fleet maintenance services. "I'm sorry," Vincent said. "Who?" "Mr. Stroud. He visited your shop last week. Navy coat." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "He was in for a front caliper. That's right." There was something warm in her voice, like she was used to these conversations surprising people. "Mr. Stroud's company operates a fleet of service vehicles in Ontario. 43 units currently. He's been looking for a reliable, independent shop to manage preventive maintenance and priority repairs. He'd like to discuss whether your capacity would allow for that arrangement." Vincent sat down on the stool he kept behind the counter. He looked at the wall, at Clara's drawing. 43 vehicles, he said. 43, yes. He'd want to start with a 3-month trial, standard contract terms, everything put in writing. He mentioned you have another bay that isn't currently in use. "I've been running 2 bays. I have the space for a 3rd. He thought that might be the case. A brief pause. "He'd also like to know, and you can say, no, this is entirely separate, if you'd be open to him referring the arrangement to 2 colleagues of his who operate smaller fleets in the area. Similar businesses." Vincent didn't say anything for a few seconds. He was doing the math, and the math was doing something to him that he hadn't expected, something that sat between disbelief and a feeling he didn't have a good word for. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Why?" "He came in for a caliper. Why is he doing this?" There was a pause. "Not uncertain," considered. "He told me," Corinne said carefully, "that the diagnostic report was in a plastic sleeve, and that you told her about the brakes even though you knew she wasn't going to pay you. He said he spent 30 years building a company on the principle that how you do the small things is how you do all things. He said he'd been looking for someone who understood that, and now he'd found one." She let that sit. "Also, his daughter has been known to, let's say, test people." and he spent a long time thinking about what kind of people she tests badly. The meeting was at a coffee shop on King Street, not a boardroom. Gerald Stroud was already there when Vincent arrived. Same navy coat, the same deliberate stillness. They shook hands. Gerald ordered tea. Vincent ordered a coffee, then immediately worried that the mug had a drip on the outside that he kept having to wipe on his jeans. Gerald didn't notice or didn't say anything. They talked for an hour and a half. Gerald had started his company, Stroud Infrastructure Services, 38 years ago with a used van, a contract with a single property management company, and a legal pad full of notes. Now it managed facilities maintenance for commercial properties across southern Ontario. The fleet included plumbing, HVAC, electrical, and general repair units. He was looking, he said, for a mechanic he could trust not to tell him things were fine when they weren't. I've had shops sign off on vehicles I knew needed work, he said, because it was easier or because they didn't want the conversation. I'd rather know. He looked at Vincent. I think you'd rather tell me. I always tell people what I find, Vincent said. I know. Gerald had asked around, he said. 2 other business owners in the industrial strip had given Vincent's name without prompting when Gerald asked about reliable tradespeople in the area. He hadn't started from scratch. The caliper, Vincent said. You knew about it. I noticed the noise myself, but I wanted to see how you handled it. Gerald picked up his tea, held it without drinking. You showed me the part. You explained what would happen if it was ignored. You didn't add anything to the bill that wasn't there. A pause. There was a $15 difference between what I expected to pay and what you charged. I'd budgeted for $2.50 labor rates posted outside, Vincent said. Gerald smiled again, that same small, real smile. Yes, it is. The contract was signed 3 weeks later. Fleet maintenance for 43 vehicles, scheduled on a rotating basis with priority booking for breakdowns. The rate was agreed and put in writing. Gerald's 2 colleagues, a man named Ernest Ouellette, who ran a landscaping operation out of Brampton, and a woman named Susan Finlay, whose company did commercial cleaning contracts, reached out within the month. Both signed on. Vincent hired a 3rd mechanic. His name was Thierry. He'd been working at a dealership for 8 years and wanted out for reasons Vincent recognized entirely, and he turned out to be the kind of person who made the shop feel more like itself rather than less. He moved Clara to a different school, not because there was anything wrong with the old one, but because the new one was closer to the shop and she could come in on PA days and do her homework on the counter and eat the peanut butter crackers he kept in the drawer for her. She had stopped saying she wanted to be a car doctor. Now she said she wanted to own the shop. Vincent had framed that too. He put it next to the first drawing. He thought sometimes about Daphne Stroud. Not with anger. That had lasted about 48 hours and then faded because he'd been too busy for it. He thought about her the way you think about something that almost happened differently. She had driven away in that Audi with the worn brake pads, and she'd pulled out of the lot and turned left and disappeared, and whatever happened after that had nothing to do with him. He hoped she'd taken the report to another shop. He thought it was unlikely, but he hoped. He found out eventually that she did. Corinne Bakshi mentioned it one afternoon when she stopped by to drop off paperwork. Almost in passing, the way you mention something that's funny in retrospect, rather than at the time. Gerald, she said, had asked his daughter about the brakes about 2 weeks after the incident at the shop. He'd framed it as a question about the car. She'd said she'd found a place that was more reasonable. Gerald had said nothing. He was good at that, Corinne said, at letting things arrive at their own conclusions. There's a quality that's hard to name, that some people have and most don't, where they can watch something happen and understand what it means without needing to explain it to anyone. Vincent's father had it. Gerald Stroud had it. Vincent thought he might be developing it himself, slowly, in the particular way that single fathers develop things. In the margins of time, between the morning drop-off and the first customer, between the dinner dishes and checking on a sleeping kid who'd kicked her blankets off again. He had never been the kind of man who told stories about himself. He kept things in the drawer where they belonged. But sometimes when Kevin asked about how things had changed, Kevin, who was a good mechanic and a decent person and still learning that the two weren't automatically the same, Vincent would tell him about the caliper. Not the contract, not the fleet, just the caliper. He'd say, there was a man who came in knowing exactly what was wrong with his truck, and instead of telling me that, he let me find it. He read every line of the invoice. He counted out the exact change. And he paid $212 for a job on a vehicle he could have taken anywhere in the city. Because he wanted to see how I handled a job when I thought it didn't matter. It always mattered. That was the thing he kept trying to tell Kevin. Not in a lecture, just in the small daily ways that eventually accumulated into something. The diagnostic report goes in a sleeve. You tell them about the brakes even when they're not listening. You post the rate at the door and you don't move off it. Not for the people who wave their hands, and not for anyone else. Clara came in on a Wednesday afternoon in November, dropped her backpack on the chair in the waiting area, and announced that she'd gotten full marks on her reading assessment. Vincent came out from the bay with his gloves still on, and he held his arms out the way you do when you can't quite hug someone properly, and she hugged him anyway, grease and all, because she was 7 and she didn't mind. "I knew you would," he said. "You always say that. I'm always right." She pulled back and looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed recently, slightly skeptical, one eyebrow doing something complicated. "Dad, you said the Leafs were going to win last Tuesday. That's different. How is that different?" "Because I know you," he said. "The Leafs, I'm just hoping." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things, and then she went to get the crackers from the drawer. And Vincent went back to the bay where a minivan was waiting. And outside on Wilson Avenue, the afternoon light was doing what it does in November in Ontario. Low and pale and slanted, catching the dust on the windows, making the ordinary things look briefly like something else. He had a job to finish. He finished it.